My grandmother's bakery was the first place where I learned to be useful. At 6, I swept crumbs between the ovens while she worked beside me in silence. Years later, when she died, my family gave me her old recipe cards and called that my share. I was still trying to understand how to mourn my grandmother. My family was already deciding what price to put on her bakery. Then they prepared to sell her name, her ovens, and 52 years of work for $3 million. But 3 days before closing, a certified letter arrived in Boston. Inside was something Grandma had placed in my name years earlier, something they needed to sell, something they could not touch without me. My grandmother's name was May. She was 78 years old when she died last spring. She had run the same small bakery on the same small street in the same small town since the year my mother was 3. She had opened it in the year her husband died. She had been 26. She had 2 small daughters and no other plan. She bought the building with the life insurance payout, taught herself to bake, and opened her doors 6 months later. She kept them open for 52 years. The bakery was called May's. The sign on the front was hand-painted in faded green letters. The smell of the place was the most consistent thing about my childhood. Brown butter, yeast, coffee, cinnamon in the fall. I could close my eyes and tell you, by smell alone, what day of the week it was inside. I spent every summer there from the time I was 6 until I was 17. My grandmother gave me a small white apron with my name embroidered on the pocket. My job at 6 was to sweep crumbs off the floor between the 2 ovens. By 8, I was scooping cookie dough. By 14, I was making the brown butter myself on the back burner, while my grandmother kept one eye on me and the other on the morning customers. May was not a warm woman in the way some grandmothers are warm. She did not hug, she did not say I love you. She communicated in observations and corrections and the kind of small praise that a child remembered for 30 years. Once when I was 9, I told her that I had measured out the salt for the bread dough and that I thought I had done it right. She looked at the dough. She nodded. She told me, in the dry voice she used for the things she actually meant, that I had hands that paid attention. I have thought about that sentence at least once a week for 24 years. When I was 17, on my last summer at the bakery before college, I told her that I wanted to become a pastry chef. She did not react with excitement. She did not hug me. She did not say she had always known. She just nodded and she said, in the same dry voice, that she had thought so. She bought me a small wooden rolling pin that afternoon. She bought it from a woodworker who had a shop 2 towns over. She had him burn my name into the handle, in small, careful letters. She gave it to me at the end of the summer, in a plain paper bag, the way she gave most gifts. I have kept that rolling pin on the small shelf above my workstation in Boston for 15 years. My family thought of the bakery as a business that ran on its own and occasionally produced cookies. They did not know, because they had never asked, that my grandmother had developed a particular shortbread cookie in 1987 that had been written up in a regional food magazine. People drove from Boston to buy them. The bakery shipped boxes of them across the country during the holidays. They were called May's brown butter cookies. They were the reason the bakery had stayed in business through 3 recessions. In 1988, my grandmother had federally registered the name May's brown butter cookies as a trademark. The recipe itself was never registered anywhere. She protected it the old-fashioned way. She kept it secret. She had not told the family. They did not know what a trademark was. They knew there was a building, equipment, and a small house behind the bakery where my grandmother had lived alone for 45 years. When my grandmother passed away last May, the family knew about the building. They did not know about the trademark. She died on a Tuesday morning in the small house behind the bakery. She had finished her morning shift the day before. She had gone home at the usual time. She had not woken up. The doctor said her heart had given out in her sleep, peacefully, the way she had probably wanted to go. I drove up that afternoon. I was the first one there. Ruth, who had worked at the bakery as the morning baker for 30 years, was sitting on the back porch of the small house when I arrived. She had been the one to find my grandmother. She did not say much. She held my hand on the porch for a long time. The bakery was closed for the first time in 52 years. My mother, Janet, flew in from Connecticut. My Aunt Pamela drove down from Burlington. My cousin Heather, who is 2 years older than I am, came with Pamela. My father, Paul, came too. He did not say much. My father is a quiet man, and he had been even quieter in the months before my grandmother passed, because he had been close to her in his own way, which was to sit at the kitchen counter of the bakery on the rare visits we made together, and to eat a cinnamon roll and to nod at her without speaking. The estate meeting was the week after the funeral, in the small office of a lawyer named Margaret who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 30 years. Margaret was in her 60s. She had short white hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of voice that lawyers in small towns develop when they have been doing the same work for a long time. She read the will out loud. My grandmother had left the bakery building jointly to her 2 daughters, Pamela and Janet, with Pamela holding the larger share because she was the older daughter. She had left the small house behind the bakery, jointly, to her 2 daughters as well. She had left the small savings account she had maintained for 50 years in equal shares. To me, she had left a small box of recipe cards. The box was on Margaret's desk, a wooden one, about the size of a shoebox with a small brass clasp. Margaret slid it across. I opened it. The recipe cards were inside, in my grandmother's careful handwriting on index cards she had used for 50 years. They were yellowed at the edges. There were perhaps 200 of them. I closed the box. I thanked Margaret. I did not cry in the office. I cried in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes. My Aunt Pamela had already, in the week between the funeral and the will reading, begun the conversation about selling the bakery. She told the family it was the only sensible thing to do. The bakery had been losing money since May had begun to slow down. Pamela lived in Burlington and could not run it. Janet had never been interested. Heather worked in marketing. There was no one in the family who was going to take it over. What Pamela did not say at that meeting was that a representative from Hearth & Company, a national artisan food brand that acquired small regional bakeries, had contacted her 1 week after my grandmother passed. Hearth & Company wanted to buy the bakery. They wanted the building. They wanted the equipment. They wanted most of all the recipe and the name. They had offered $3 million. I did not know about Hearth & Company for almost 4 months. I learned about it in October, in a phone call from my cousin Heather, who had called me ostensibly to see how I was doing but who had spent most of the conversation telling me about the wonderful opportunity the family had been offered. She had told me in the voice of a person who was rehearsing language she had heard from a marketing department that Hearth & Company would honor my grandmother's legacy by bringing her cookies to a national audience. I had asked her carefully what was being sold. She had told me everything. The building, the equipment, the recipe, the name, the trademark. I had not said anything for a moment. I told her I would think about it. I hung up. I did not sleep that night. The closing of the sale was scheduled for the 3rd week in November. The certified letter from Margaret arrived at my apartment in Boston on the 2nd Monday in November. I opened the envelope at my kitchen counter that night, after my shift at the restaurant. I had not had time during the day. I had assumed it was something administrative, an estate document I needed to sign, a notification about the building's title transfer. It was not. The first page was on Margaret's law firm letterhead. The second page was a federal trademark certificate. The third page was a transfer of beneficiary interest, signed by my grandmother and notarized by Margaret, dated almost 3 years before my grandmother had passed away. I read the first page 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. Margaret had written me a short cover letter. She told me she had received notification of the impending sale. She wanted to make sure I knew that the trademark was not owned by the bakery's corporate entity or by my grandmother's estate. It had been transferred 3 years earlier to me. I was the sole owner of the trademark. My family could sell the building, they could sell the equipment, they could sell my grandmother's small house. They could not sell the name. They could not sell the right to produce cookies under the name May's Brown Butter Cookies. And they could not sell my grandmother's recipe as if it were theirs to give away. Hearth & Company could not buy what they had agreed to pay $3 million for. I sat at my kitchen counter for a long time. I called Margaret in the morning. She told me she had been hoping I would call. She had been waiting for 3 years to send me that letter. My grandmother had asked her to send it only if a need arose. The need had arisen. She told me she would clear her schedule the following day if I could drive up to Vermont. I drove up on Wednesday morning. I parked outside Margaret's small office on the main street, 2 blocks from the bakery. The closed sign had been in the window since the funeral. Margaret took me back to a small conference room. She had laid out the documents on the table. She told me the story. 3 years earlier, my grandmother had come to Margaret's office. She had told Margaret she wanted to take care of something quietly. She had been thinking for a long time about who would care for the parts of the bakery that money could not measure. The building was a building. The equipment was equipment. Those would go to her daughters. But the cookies were a different thing. The cookies were a recipe she had developed herself, over years, with brown butter she had learned to make from a Quebec cook in the late 60s, and with a salt blend she had developed herself in the 70s. The cookies had been written about. They had carried the bakery through decades. They were, my grandmother had told Margaret, the only thing she had ever made that she felt strongly enough about to want to protect. My grandmother had told Margaret that she wanted the trademark transferred to me. She had told Margaret it was because I was the only person in the family who understood what the recipe actually was. She had told her I was the only person who would know how to make it, how to keep it, how to decide what to do with it. She had told Margaret she did not want her daughters to sell the recipe to a corporation that would mass produce it with the wrong flour and the wrong butter, and call it maize. She had told Margaret she would rather see the recipe disappear than see it watered down. She had told Margaret she trusted me to decide. Margaret had handled the paperwork. The transfer had been filed federally. The notarization had been completed. The documents had been sealed in a folder in Margaret's office for almost 3 years. My grandmother had not told me. She had told Margaret she did not want me to feel obligated. She had wanted me to choose my own path without the weight of an inheritance influencing what I did. She had told Margaret that if I had left pastry for a different career, Margaret was to make sure the final notebook and the recipe were eventually released with my grandmother's name attached, so the town where she had spent her life would not lose them completely. But I had not left pastry. I had stayed. I had become exactly the woman my grandmother had thought I would become. Margaret told me that my grandmother had called her 6 months before she died to confirm one last time that the transfer was still in place. She had asked Margaret to be very careful with the documents. She had told Margaret she could feel her time getting closer. She had told Margaret that the trademark was the only thing she had ever owned, that she had built entirely herself. Margaret had carried that conversation for 2 years. She had not been allowed to contact me, my mother, or my aunt. She had been waiting, like a quiet weight on a high shelf, for the moment she would have to act. The moment had come. I asked Margaret what my options were. She told me I could halt the sale. The sale could not include the trademark. Hearth & Company would have to renegotiate, or they would walk away. She told me the trademark, on its own, in the current artisan food market, was worth significantly more than what Hearth & Company was paying for the bundle. A senior trademark attorney she had consulted had estimated the value, conservatively, at between $2 and $3 million on its own. She told me my family did not know any of this yet. What I did next was up to me. I went to the bakery before I called my family. I had a key. My grandmother had given me one when I was 12 and had never asked for it back. I let myself in through the back door. The bakery had been closed for 6 months, but it had not been cleaned out. The shelves were still there. The ovens were still there. The small cooler where my grandmother had kept her butter was still humming. I walked through the front room. The wooden dish where she had kept business cards was still on the counter. The cinnamon canister was on the shelf above the work surface. The chalkboard with the day's specials, in her handwriting, still said cinnamon rolls and brown butter cookies. She had written it the morning of the day before she passed. I went into the small back office where she had kept her papers. The desk was a small oak one she had bought used in 1971. The rolling pin she had used herself, every day for 52 years, was in the second drawer. I had not been able to bring myself to take it out in the months after she died. I took it out now. I held it. The handle was worn smooth from her hands. Underneath the rolling pin, in the same drawer, was a small leather-bound notebook I had never seen before. The notebook was the size of a paperback book. The cover was scuffed and softened from decades of being held. I opened it. The first page was dated 1985. It was the year my grandmother had begun developing the brown butter cookie. The pages of the notebook were a meticulous record of every attempt. different butters, different sugars, different salts, different ratios, different temperatures, different chilling times. My grandmother had treated the development of that cookie the way a scientist treats a long experiment. There were notes on what had worked and what had not. There were drawings of cross-sections of the cookies showing the layering of butter pockets. There were 217 recipes, each one slightly different from the next, until the final one, in the back, marked with a small star and the date she had decided it was finished. April 12, 1987. I sat at her desk in the back office of her bakery for almost 2 hours, reading the notebook. I called my mother that evening. I told her I was already in Vermont. I told her I needed her and Aunt Pamela and Heather to come to the bakery the next morning. I told her there was something she needed to know before the sale closed. She asked me what I was talking about. I told her I would explain in the morning. She told me she did not appreciate being summoned. I told her she needed to come. I hung up. My mother arrived at the bakery the next morning at 10 with Aunt Pamela and Heather. My father had stayed in Connecticut because, my mother told me at the door, he had not been able to get out of work. Margaret was already at the bakery. She had brought the documents. We sat at one of the small tables in the front room. The chairs scraped against the floor. My grandmother's chalkboard was still on the wall behind us. Margaret told them, in the same dry, careful voice my grandmother had used, that there was a matter related to the impending sale that needed to be addressed before the closing could proceed. She handed Pamela the federal trademark certificate. Pamela read it. Her face did not change for almost 10 seconds. Then it began to change in small increments, the way a face changes when a person realizes they have been wrong about something for longer than they want to remember. She set the certificate down. She looked at Margaret. She asked her what this was. Margaret told her. She walked them through it. The trademark was a federally registered asset. It had been transferred 3 years before my grandmother's death to me. The transfer had been filed correctly, notarized correctly, and was current and active. The bakery's corporate entity did not own the trademark. The estate did not own it. The buyer could not acquire it without my signature. The sale could not include the trademark. Aunt Pamela told Margaret this could not be right. She told her my grandmother would not have done this. She told her she had been the daughter who had taken care of my grandmother. She had been the one who had handled the bills in the last 2 years. She had been the one who had argued for the sale because it was the only sensible thing to do. Margaret told her, gently, that all of those things were true, and none of them changed what the document said. My mother sat very still. She turned the certificate over slowly. She looked at me. She asked me when I had known. I told her I had received the letter on Monday. I told her I had not known before. She asked me if I had done something to make this happen. I told her I had not. I told her my grandmother had done it 3 years ago and had told me nothing. I told her I had spent the last 48 hours sitting in this bakery reading my grandmother's notebook and thinking about what I was going to do. My mother said, in a voice that was already not the voice she had walked in with, "We are going to lose $3 million. Aunt Pamela stood up. She told Margaret she would be consulting her own lawyer. She told me she was sure I had not understood what I was doing. She told me my grandmother had been an old woman in the last years, and that old women did things that did not represent their actual wishes. She told me she would not let me steal what was rightfully the family's. Margaret told her, gently, that there were federal records of my grandmother's clarity of mind at the time of the transfer, and that any contestation would not succeed. Aunt Pamela left without saying anything to me. Heather followed. My mother stayed. She sat at the table for almost 10 minutes after they were gone. She did not say anything. She picked up the certificate again. She put it down. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I did not know yet. The sale to Hearth & Company did not close in November. Hearth & Company contacted me directly 2 weeks after the meeting at the bakery. They sent a lawyer from their corporate office in Boston, a man in his 40s, with a very practiced phone manner. He told me the company had been disappointed to learn about the trademark situation, but very much wanted to find a way forward. He asked to schedule a meeting. I met him at a coffee shop in Boston the following week. He brought a small folder. He had prepared an offer. Hearth & Company would purchase the trademark directly, separate from the bakery, for $2.5 million. They would produce maize brown butter cookies under license. They would honor the recipe. They would, in his words, treat the brand with the respect it deserved. He slid the folder across the table. I asked him what they planned to do with the recipe. He told me they would produce the cookies in 3 of their commercial facilities. They would distribute nationally through their existing retail partners. They expected first-year sales of around 12 million units. They would adjust the recipe slightly for production at scale, but the adjustments, he assured me, would be minimal. I asked him what adjustments. He told me the brown butter step would be replaced with a brown butter flavor compound. The salt blend would be standardized. The flour would be a different brand because their facilities had supplier contracts. The cookies would be packaged in a 4-pack with a label that referenced May but carried the Hearth & Company branding more prominently. I asked him how much of my grandmother's recipe would remain. He told me, with a smile that was supposed to be reassuring, that the spirit of the recipe would remain. I closed the folder. I slid it back across the table to him. I told him I appreciated his time. I told him my grandmother had spent 2 years and 217 attempts developing that recipe. I told him she had registered the trademark to make sure it could not be replaced by a flavor compound and a different brand of flour. I told him I was not going to sell the trademark. He told me, in the careful voice that lawyers use when they have not been told no in a while, that the offer was significantly higher than what most people in my position would expect to receive. I told him I was not most people in my position. I told him I was the granddaughter of the woman who had made the cookies. I left the coffee shop. I drove back to my apartment. I called my mother that evening. I told her what I had decided. She did not respond for a long time. Then she told me, in a voice that was steady but not warm, that I had cost the family $2.5 million. I told her I had not cost the family anything. The bakery building and the small house could still be sold. The estate would still receive proceeds for those. My grandmother had left those parts to Pamela and Janet. Those parts were not in question. I told her what was in question was a recipe my grandmother had developed alone and had decided, alone, to leave to me. My mother told me she would think about it. She did not call me back for almost a month. Aunt Pamela called me twice. The first call was an attempt at reconciliation. The second call was a threat to contest the transfer in court. Neither call went anywhere. Margaret had told me that Aunt Pamela's own lawyer had likely already informed her that there was no case. There was not. I gave my notice at the restaurant in January. I moved to Vermont in February. I had not decided to take over the bakery. I moved because I needed to be in the place where my grandmother had been in order to figure out what to do next. I rented a small apartment 2 doors down from the bakery. I walked there every morning. I let myself in with the key she had given me when I was 12. I worked in the back office for the first 6 weeks. I read the notebook. I read the recipe cards. I read the small ledger my grandmother had kept of the daily takings for 50 years. I called Ruth, who had been let go when the bakery had closed. She came in one afternoon and sat with me at the front counter, and we talked for 2 hours about my grandmother and about whether something might be done with it. Ruth told me she was 68, and that she had not yet been ready to stop baking when my grandmother died. She told me she would come back if I opened the doors. I opened the doors on the first Saturday in April. I did not advertise, I did not announce. I made the cookies the way my grandmother had taught me. Ruth made the cinnamon rolls and the bread the way she had made them for 30 years. The teenage girl from the neighboring town who had worked the register on weekends came back when she heard we were open. The small chalkboard in the window said open for the first time in 11 months. The first person who came in was a woman in her 70s who had been a customer since the 1980s. She did not say anything, she just looked at me from across the counter. She bought 4 cookies. She walked out of the bakery holding the bag with both hands. By noon, there was a line down the block. By the end of the second weekend, a regional food magazine had called. I did not give an interview. I told the writer, kindly, that I was not doing publicity. I told her the bakery was open on Saturdays from 7 in the morning until we ran out, which was usually around 2. That was almost a year ago. I have opened the bakery every Saturday since. We make the cookies and the cinnamon rolls and the bread my grandmother made. We do not ship, we do not deliver. People drive from Boston, from Albany, from Montreal. Most buy 4 cookies. We sell out by early afternoon every week. I have not sold the trademark. I have not licensed it. I have, with Margaret's help, written a clause into my own will. If I pass without someone I trust to carry it forward, the notebook goes to the Town Historical Society. The trademark will be abandoned. And the final recipe will be released with my grandmother's name attached, exactly the way she wrote it. My grandmother had written that wish herself. I kept it. The bakery building and the small house were sold last summer to a young couple who had moved up from Boston, wanting to start a small inn. They run the inn out of the small house. They have not done anything to the bakery building because the lease allows me to use it on the Saturdays we are open. The lease was a condition I had requested through Margaret. It was the only thing about the sale I had asked for. My Aunt Pamela did not invite me to the closing, my mother did not call me on my birthday last spring, my father did. He called me on a Wednesday in May. He told me, in the quiet voice of a man who had been talked over by his wife for 40 years, that he was sorry. He had thought, for a long time, about what had happened. He had watched my grandmother teach me how to make cookies when I was 7, and he had known then who would end up with the recipe. He told me he should have said something. He did not ask for anything in return. He just said he was sorry. I told him I knew. I have kept the card in the small wooden box where I keep the things I cannot throw away. My grandmother's box of recipe cards is on a shelf above the workstation at the bakery now. I read one of the cards every Saturday morning before we open. I do not need the recipes, I know them all. I read them because the handwriting is hers. The rolling pin she gave me when I was 17 is on the same shelf, with my name still burned into the handle. The rolling pin she used herself, every day for 52 years, is on the work counter. I use it on Saturdays. About a month ago, a small girl came into the bakery with her mother. She was maybe 7. She looked up at me from across the counter. She asked me, in the quiet voice that a 7-year-old uses when she is asking a question she has been thinking about, if she could see the cookies being made. I let her come behind the counter. I gave her a small clean apron, then I gave her a small piece of dough and showed her how to roll it gently between her palms. We pressed it flat together, just enough, the way my grandmother had taught me. I did not say anything to her about what she reminded me of. I did not need to. Who in your life decided your share was sentiment while theirs was money? Drop your story in the comments. There is one thing I learned from all of this, and it is the last thing I will share. A person who really sees you does not announce it. They do something quiet, years before you know about it, and they leave it sitting on a high shelf for the day you need it. Some things are not left to you because they are valuable. They become valuable because someone trusted you with them. That was what my grandmother left me. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe. I am here every week with stories about the quiet things people leave behind, the families who overlook them, and the women who finally understand what was meant for them. I want to know who is here with me tonight, and what city you are watching from. Take care of yourselves.